Hi everyone, I'm Lazy Cat Lady, and today I'm going to be doing a set review of Wilds of Eldraine. There weren't really a lot of cards specifically for any of my pet decks, but I always like to keep an eye out, both for what's going to change with the current meta decks, and also to keep a lookout for new cards that could create, new and interesting archetypes. So let's get into it. I'm just going to be doing a tier list for Modern. Modern is the only format I play, and so here's kind of a breakdown of what I split my tiers into. S tier, I think might be broken. As you'll see later, there's only one card in that tier, but it's good to keep an eye out for stuff that might break the format. A is powerful cards that'll definitely see play. There were a couple of those from this set. For my category B, I think is cards that are going to be worth testing. They may not end up being good, but there are several cards from this set that I think should be tested to find out if they're good enough to compete. C tier is going to be, there's a couple cards that are playable in some, like a weaker archetype in Modern, so not necessarily really impactful cards, but they could be upgrades for a certain deck. And then D, there's a card in category D that we'll get to, and it's not really playable necessarily, but I think it's good to keep in mind because as more cards get printed, it could become more relevant in the format. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start off with the card that I put in the D tier, which is Collector's Vault. Draw a card, discard a card, create a treasure token for 2 mana. So the reason I think it's kind of not really playable is because of that 2 mana activation and the 2 mana cost. And I'm highlighting here Omen Hawker and Oval Chase Daredevil. Obviously Oval Chase works really well with Collector's Vault, just like with Underworld Cookbook. And Omen Hawker is really the only saving grace, I think, for this card. You can turn 1 Omen Hawker and then turn 2 play and activate Collector's Vault. And I think that's really the only way to make this card perform, really well in Modern. But Omen Hawker, being a 1/1, it just dies to everything, especially with Bowmasters running around. So I don't think that this is really viable at the moment, but I'll probably end up testing some kind of Asmo shell with, Oval Chase, Omen Hawker, and Collector's Vault at some point. I just don't think it's going to be powerful enough to keep up with the format. Definitely an interesting card, though. I wish it was, 1 less mana in the cost or 1 less mana in the activation. Okay, for the C tier, which was cards that are just upgrades for weaker decks in the format, there are a couple really good prints for fairy decks. Fairy Fencing, target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. It gets an additional -3/-3 if you controlled a fairy as you cast the spell. So this is just like 1 mana -3/-3. And I know the current fairies deck, their like prime removal is Fatal Push. So, they can never kill a fury, which I think is kind of a problem. And there's several other threats that, it's just harder for them to kill, and Fairy Fencing can just 1 mana kill a Fury. So I think it definitely has some nice upsides over Fatal Push. And then you've got Obira Dreaming Duelist, Fairy, Flash Flying. Whenever another Fairy enters the battlefield under your control, each opponent loses 1 life. So I'm highlighting Bitter Blossom here because one thing I've noticed, and I've in fact played Fairies, in just like a casual match a couple of days ago. One thing it really struggles with is closing the game. Almost all its threats are 1/1s, and if you can get an Obira and a Bitter Blossom in play, all of a sudden fairies can actually close a game pretty quickly with that life loss. So I think these are definitely going to be some upgrades for that deck, but I'm not sure it'll necessarily matter too much since the deck doesn't perform super well against the broad meta. Alright, on to our next tier, B tier, which are cards that I think could be powerful, but I think are going to need some testing. So Tough Cookie is pretty interesting. I still don't think it goes in my favorite Sultai Time Sieve archetype, but people in the Hell's Kitchen Discord did point out that since Tough Cookie is a food, and Asmo says sacrifice 2 foods, it doesn't specify token, Tough Cookie all by itself makes, 2 foods, so it's, just a 2 mana make a removal spell for Asmo. And its second ability, target non-creature artifact you control becomes a 4/4 artifact creature until end of turn. Theoretically, Tough Cookie can, pump out some more damage and make a food deck a little more aggressive. Also, food decks often play Unearth, and Tough Cookie can get Unearthed. So I think it should definitely get tested in some of the more aggro-based food decks, probably red-green food and green-black. Yeah, so it's an interesting card, but definitely it's not like explosive, so got to take a look at its shells. The next card I put in the B tier is Knight of the Sweet's Revenge. I think for a lot of food decks it just doesn't quite fit. The 4 mana is very expensive for most food decks. Like my Sultai Timesieve deck only plays 1 copy of the One Ring because you just often don't have 4 mana. You often have like 2 to 3 lands, especially with Urza's Saga. But I think it has kind of a unique slot in a Kinnan food deck. With Kinnan in play, casting Knight of the Sweet's Revenge, you make a food when it enters. If you have just 1 other food, it already paid for itself. So it's like 0 mana, make a food token. And if you have a bunch of other foods lying around, you can just immediately start, cracking foods, or you might even be able to activate its second ability, which gives you creatures +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of food that you control. So it's kind of like an endgame closer if you have a couple threats that can get through. And also Gilded Goose works really well with it. Gilded Goose and Kinnan. Gilded Goose tapping for 2 mana with Kinnan in play is also pretty strong. So I think this is a shell that needs to be explored a little bit. I'm not exactly sure what else goes in the shell. You could go a couple different directions with like a Samwise, Lonis build. You could make like a Urza build and just have kind of using Knight of the Sweet's Revenge as like a couple extra copies of an Urza effect that just give you a bunch of mana. So I'll definitely try to do some testing, maybe for some Simic food decks. I also put Elvish Archivist in this tier. I think that it's possible that it's just too weak being a 0/1, but it does have some really nice synergies with existing food shells. So Underworld Cookbook, for example, if you have an Archivist in play, you play the Cookbook, you get 2 counters on your turn, and then you discard something on your opponent's turn, get another 2 counters. So you can grow it by 4 power every turn cycle, which I think is quite powerful. And then, of course, Urza's Saga, always going to be in a food deck, or almost always, unless it's like 4 color. But, drawing a card off your Urza's Saga, ETBs is pretty strong. Immediately replaces the Elvish Archivist itself. I think the current shell that I'm thinking about testing for this is like an either all green or maybe a red-green, kind of like an aggro food build. I think Rancor also has a lot of nice synergies with a deck like this, playing Teething Wormlet and Elvish Archivist as like similar creatures that just get really big really fast, and then playing Rancors to give trample to Archivists, and the Teething Wormlets and your constructs. Trample is really important in pushing through damage with big constructs. And of course Rancor draws a card off your Archivist, and if your creature dies you just get it back. So once you find another Archivist you can just keep generating card advantage. So that's the kind of shell I think I want to test this card around. I think this is the most interesting of the 3 cards that I put in the B tier. I don't think it goes in Sultai Timesieve. Again, I think Steel Seeker is better for digging for the combo, but I think this could be a really good threat in some other aggro builds. Okay, moving on to cards that are definitely going to see modern play. We got a slight upgrade for the scam decks in Not Dead After All. Until end of turn, target creature you control gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control, then create a Wicked Roll token attached to it. And that Wicked Roll gives the creature +1/+1, and when the aura is put into a graveyard, each opponent loses 1 life. So not only does this give it +1/+1 without having the counter on it, it also, you know, is just an additional damage when you remove the threat, and Scam is pretty aggressive in getting your life total down, so I think that 1 damage will be pretty relevant. So it's just something to keep in mind when you have to play against these decks, is to know that they got even better. Imagine that. Next card on this list is Beseech the Mirror. I think this card is going to be really good in a couple shells. I've seen a lot of people talk about it in shells with the One Ring, being able to tutor the One Ring or Shieldred the Apocalypse, depending on which one you want, in like a mono black coffers or no coffers list. I think it is just really powerful, and even the fact that Orcish Bowmasters has a token just sitting around that you can sacrifice as the bargain cost. It's just really going to polish and smooth out the rough edges, I think, of the mono black lists, and they're already pretty strong. I think the deck that I'm most scared for this going into is going to be Oops All Spells. You know, that deck already plays 2 mana rocks to try to get the win on turn 3. So this just could give you, in that deck, 4 extra copies of Balustrade Spy, you know. So I think this could, you know, really just like double the consistency of Oops All Spells. The triple black is a bit of a problem. It means you have to have like at least 2 black lands in play. But I think, you know, I think that deck is going to start playing at least a couple copies of this and be a lot more efficient. So that's something to keep in mind for sure. The last card I put in the A category, I'm definitely excited about it because it looks like it would be fun to play, but I think the shell that it goes best in is 4-color control. So we have Up the Beanstalk. When Up the Beanstalk enters the battlefield, and whenever you cast a spell with mana value 5 or greater, draw a card. So this, in existing 4-color control lists, Solitude, Fury, Leyline Binding, this is it turns all your best removal spells for 0 to 1 mana into also draw a card. You know, turn 2 Up the Beanstalk, and then immediately Fury or Solitude and draw a card. It just completely, you know, takes away the downside of the exile cost, which is already pretty low to begin with. So I think moving forward, I would definitely, if you like 4-color control, I would suggest testing a build using Up the Beanstalk as card advantage. I think it's really just gonna, you know, if you resolve an Up the Beanstalk, it's just gonna get you so much value. It's gonna be hard to beat. So that's definitely a really interesting card. The last card is the card that I think is probably broken from Wilds of Eldraine, and that's going to be Agatha's Soul Cauldron. You may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities of creatures you control. That's actually pretty relevant. Creatures you control with +1/+1 counters on them have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Agatha's Soul Cauldron, and then it has its activated ability, exile target card from a graveyard. When a creature card is exiled this way, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. I saw people mention this in my Discord and saying that the Hardened Scales Discord was absolutely losing it over this card. And I mean, their entire deck is just relevant creatures with activated abilities that put +1/+1 counters on themselves. I think a couple copies of this card are definitely going to be seen moving forward in Scales decks. The amount of things that you can do with this card in play with that deck is just so wild. For example, like, you know, Pithing Needle is pretty strong against Scales, but if you needle their Walking Ballista, they can just, you know, remove all the counters, kill the Walking Ballista, and then exile it with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and give, you know, Arcbound Ravager or Hangerback Walker the Walking Ballista ability, and then your Pithing Needle does nothing. So this card is definitely going to make it so much more difficult to, like, against this deck to maneuver yourself and make sure that they can't immediately kill you. Even the you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to activate abilities is relevant because Zabaz, the deck often doesn't play white source, or if they do play white sources, it's only a few. So this is a situation where if a Zabaz is in your graveyard, you could, for a couple white mana, which you can spend any of your lands to activate it, you can give your whole team flying, which, you know, just, you know, you don't even need, you know, this is really going to blow up some of the lines for that deck. Also, the deck plays like one Haywire Mite in the sideboard. All of a sudden, you can turn like Thopters that you made off of Hangerback Walker into Haywire Mites, basically. So I think, you know, there's just so many options for this card that just make lines to kill a lot easier for this deck. So I think it's going to make Scales broken. It could be that it doesn't, but I think it's such a powerful. It's like, I couldn't imagine a more perfect card that you could print for the Scales deck. So it's pretty scary. Now, just as like a recap, here's the cards now in the tiers that I placed them. Yeah, I think I'm pretty excited to test Elvish Archivist in some food builds. I'll definitely do a little testing with Collector's Vault because I think it looks fun, but maybe not broken. I'd definitely, in the format moving forward, be really wary of Beseech the Mirror, Up the Beanstalk, Agatha's Soul Cauldron. I think those are going to have a pretty big impact over the next couple weeks. So yeah, this has been my set review for Wilds of Eldraine. I'm pretty excited for some of these cards, and I hope you enjoyed watching.